Good morning and welcome to the 31st meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. We have had apologies from both the convener and deputy convener today, and as the oldest member of the committee, it is my role to chair the meeting while we appoint a temporary convener. In the spirit of the appointment of a temporary convener, as I said, as I am the oldest, I have that role. Are there any nominations for the role of convener other than myself as the oldest one in the room today? You're all content for me to take on the role, so thank you for that. Yeah, the first item on the agenda is to decide whether to take item 4 in private. Our members agree to do that. Thank you. Item 5 in private. So 4 and 5 are both in private. Thank you. The next item is to take evidence from the Scottish Public Ombudsman. And we're delighted to welcome to the committee this morning Paul McFadden, who is the Ombudsman. He's accompanied by Andrew Crawford, Head of Improvement Standards and Engagement, and Slider, who is the Head of Investigation, Public Services and Complaints. You're very welcome this morning. There's no need for you to deal with your microphones. They will come on automatically. And at the beginning, Mr McFadden, do you want to make a short opening statement?
Yes, thank you, convener.
Okay. If you can do that, that would be fine. Thank you to start. Thank you.
Thank you. So, may I first start by putting on record how much of a privilege it is to have recently taken up the role of Ombudsman, and to say that I very much look forward to engaging with the Parliament over the coming years, and indeed with this committee over the remainder of this session. I took up office just over a month ago, and in that time I've been focused on assessing the SPSO and its work, meeting with all of its people, and beginning my outward focus with stakeholders across all 4 of the organisation's statutory remits. It's helpful to have this early opportunity to engage, I think, to lay out some of my early impressions, priorities, and of course address any areas of scrutiny from the committee. I understand the key focus of this is our 24-25 annual report, but of course we've had half a year pass since then, so SPSO's performance in that period since, very happy to answer questions around about that. My early impressions are of an organisation that is and has been very focused on efficiency, very focused on delivering more outcomes for people in the face of quite significant increases in demand. That's a trend that has continued into this year. 2 or 3 consecutive years of increasing the amount of work that the organisation puts out. This year alone, a 17% increase in the number of public service complaints compared to last year. Some 400 additional complaints resolved so far. But the demand and pressure on the organisation is something that is accelerating. I think the latest figures we have show that we, as an organisation, in terms of public service complaints, have received 40% more than we did in the equivalent period last year. Now, that's on the back of successive increases in demand pressures from people needing our help in previous years. So there has been a focus on wait times and reducing that to an acceptable level. There has been a focus on doing more and reviewing ways of working. I think that's something that is now being placed under very significant pressure. So a 40% increase in demand is quite a significant challenge, and is certainly a critical risk, and something that I've been very focused on, as you'll appreciate, in my short time in post already. I think my predecessor, Rosemary, with the committee towards the end of last year, indicated that, in her view, it was approaching a point where the organisation would struggle and would be at the limits of what it was able to do. And I do think we've reached a point where that is certainly something early for me to consider. The annual report provides updates across the wider aspects of our function: whistleblowing, Scottish Welfare Fund, our external focus. And I'm joined by Andrew Crawford, who held the role of acting ombudsman from April as I awaited taking up post. Judy Sadler, who's our head of investigations and public service complaints. Very happy to answer questions across all of the annual report and our activity, and indeed some of what I've just outlined to the committee.
Thank you for your opening statement. We have a number of members who are online, as you can see, and they will join and do some questions. But if I can maybe start by opening the questions to you, Mr McFadden. You've talked about your priorities there and of an overview of where you think you are. It would be good to know, because you've come from other parts of the United Kingdom and you've worked in other areas, if the office can learn from any of the processes that you have been involved in, and if there is scope within the organisation to see that development and cohesion possibly across. It would be good to get a view of that, if you could. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I do bring experience from across the UK in different roles, different ombudsman roles, and I think there is much to learn. I think there are opportunities there. I mean, I think there is, in broad terms, when I look at the organisation and its focus on handling certainly maladministration complaints, there is a lot of comparability across other ombudsman organisations. In the face of quite similar challenges, I think the demand challenge and long-term sustained pressures on ombudsman means that the ombudsman model has and is evolving. I think it is increasingly across the board, including in my previous roles, looking at ways in which we can make decisions earlier, get to outcomes, be more outcome focused as early as possible in a process to try and avoid people going through the full investigative process that may bring quite a lot of challenge for them and indeed resource for organisations. So it is about, there's a lot of comparability there. I think there are things we can learn in terms of some of that resolution approach, how we focus on that. I think there are, for me, at a kind of strategic level, I think there is more that we as an organisation and certainly over my time as Ombudsman look to do in terms of our impact, in terms of the visibility of our impact, in terms of how systemic we are in our focus, and in terms of how we are feeding that back and connecting that to public services, understanding demand, drivers of demand, and trying to target and assess ways in which we can help use our unique vantage point, to try and stem some of that rising demand increases in particular areas of service. I think with the pressures on organisations, I think ways of working is something that we are going to have to look at. Now, the organisation has been focused, as I say, on a lot of that, and a lot of that is comparable in terms of approach with other ombudsman organisations. But there are other things that are going on, and I think there are opportunities, particularly around digital and AI, where my assessment is that others, and including with the legal ombudsman in my previous role, were perhaps a little further ahead in that journey of understanding the opportunities that could come from AI and digital to support investigation processes, to try and mine a little bit more of our data. The potential of our data is huge. I think it's about trying to kind of understand how we can draw that out. So that that's one early focus I've had with the leadership team here and staff, is how we can harness that. So I think there's more we can do in terms of building confidence in the organisation, and I've noted the scrutiny of this committee over recent years, and I think there is more that we can do in well, first of all, as I say, demonstrating the visibility of the impact we have throughout our process, including preliminary investigation and not just at the kind of final statutory investigation level. I think there's more we can do there, but there's also more we can do in terms of things related to our own performance, and I think there's customer satisfaction, the levels of quality. These are all areas where I'm bringing experience from previous organisations where I think we can learn. A lot of that does come back to resource, but I certainly have already laid down a few key priorities early and more longer term.
Good. And you've touched on public satisfaction there. It would be good to get a feeling or a view of what you think the public's expectations of the SPOs are, and of what evidence you have that you're meeting some of these expectations, or are you not meeting some of those expectations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the customer satisfaction, we've recently published surveys from customers over the recent weeks relating to last year and in relation to the first half of this year. I know from my experience with other ombudsman organisations that satisfaction and expectations can be tied up very much with the outcome that individuals received in relation to their own individual complaints, and I think the challenge is always trying to get behind that to try and assess where complainants are in terms of our service. I think that as we attempt, as we resolve more complaints and make more decisions and become more outcome focused at an earlier point, I do think that is the right thing. I think that you're putting experienced people at an earlier point, undertaking some preliminary investigatory work and getting to an outcome, that can be difficult for people in terms of their expectations, and that can lead to asks for further detailed investigation. I think as for us as an organisation, we have to make sure that we are focused on doing what is right and achieving that outcome early. I think that a key indicator for me of whether or not we are delivering those quality decisions and whether we're meeting expectations is through the requests for reviews, which I as Ombudsman review personally, and I have been reviewing since I took up office. I think Rosemary Agnew, my predecessor, reviewed some 400 last year. That's a significant proportion of the complaints that we see, around 10 to 12% that we resolve, So that gives me a sense of whether or not, even where complainants are dissatisfied with the outcome and whether expectations haven't been met, I can take a personal view on that. And I think so far, and it is early days and there's more for me to review in that regard, but I think from what I have seen, our decisions are robust, they are evidence-led, and they are, on the whole, getting to a point where we are making the right decision.
The committee in the past had recommended that an instigation of a programme of externally verified consumer satisfaction data had been looked at. I mean, it would be once again good to see if you had progressed with that and if there had been any lessons learned from that, if that is the case.
So the recent customer satisfaction surveys that the organisation undertook were undertaken by the organisation itself. In previous roles, particularly with the Legal Ombudsman, we did commission externally led satisfaction surveys on an annual basis, in fact a regular basis at various points of our process. I would be keen to do that, and I know the organisation have indicated to the committee they would be keen to do that. I think that the challenge there is it comes with quite a significant cost, and I think this is all about the balance of resources and where we place our focus. I think there's more we can do and build on in terms of that recent customer satisfaction. I think when you look at what is coming out of that, what people are telling us, well, first of all, we need to work to try and get to a better response rate. I think that's something that's on record. I think that's something that is going in the right direction. The latest results show an uptake. But when you look at what people are telling you about our service, I think a lot of it does come down to communication and timeliness, as you would expect. And within that communication, I think a very clear sense that satisfaction is tied to the regularity and the frequency of updates. Now, that does correspond very much with my experience elsewhere. That is very important to people. And I think going back to that point about even where they may be disappointed in the outcome that we reach, making sure that they are very regularly updated, particularly where there is a wait or where there is a long process to follow, is very, very important. And that's where we are focused. As I say, it's early days, there is more to do there. And one of my key priorities is ensuring we look at all ways of building confidence externally in the organisation through the information that we publish on our own performance. And
you've also indicated that the complaints are at a record high, again, with reference to the services that the SPO cover. And we've in the past talked about the communication, making sure the data's correct and making sure that people are processed. And given that information, and as you had already identified, it can take some time to go through all that to ensure that you have the right information to make a decision. But why do you think that there's a record number of complaints at this moment in time? And what action are you taking to try and manage that and stem and see how the lowering of the complaints could be motivated or managed for the organisation?
Yeah, I think that the demand pressures are sustained and long term. I think that even a cursory analysis of figures in the annual report show quite significant. I think the figure from the pre-pandemic period, which is used as a baseline by the organisation, is a 40% increase. That was last year. This year it's 40% year to date. This does correspond with other organisations, and quite early on in my term I have been engaging with other public service ombudsmen across the UK to benchmark both the levels of demand, the impacts on their organisation and what may be driving that. I have experience of this from the Legal Ombudsman as well, where there is kind of similar rates of sustained demand. So I think there's a lot that's in there. I think for us, a very clear part of the reason is the pressure and strain on public services. I think prioritisation of services and public services, under strain essentially. I think that's driving increases across pretty much all areas that we cover. I think quite concerningly for us as an organisation, and also in terms of data, that we're seeing particular increases in those sectors where we do have the most complex complaints and the largest number of complaints. I think health and social care and local government would be the two sectors with some of the highest increases. I do think there are other factors in there. I think there is something post-pandemic which is societal in terms of willingness to complain. A stress on an increasing vulnerability in members of public. I think we see that. My early engagement with citizens' advice advocacy agencies is, levels of poverty, isolation. These things are all adding to a sense of increased stress, and I think that is something that other ombudsmen are seeing as well. One of the more recent kind of factors, which is in the experience here and elsewhere, is the use of AI and available AI tools to drive complaints. There is one devolved ombudsman organisation just in the last week where I've heard that they've analysed that over 50% of complaints that they are receiving are now generated through some form of AI tool. Now, there's two sides to that. One is that there is an increased accessibility and it is easier for people to complain. I think on the flip side for organisations like us, it is adding to the complexity of how those complaints are being brought. And I think a very key element of what we need to do to be able to kind of get to resolving and putting things right is understand the very root cause in simple terms. And I think there is a challenge there. So I think there's lots of kind of drivers involved there. I think in terms of what we are doing, I think in the short term, I've established a command team across the organisation to look at the drivers of complaints, to try and see if we can understand a little bit more underneath the data of what is driving that. I think my next focus is for the organisation to be a bit more outward focused with the organisations and sectors that are generating high volumes, to try and see where there are reasons but also opportunities to help manage that. I think that in the very short term, we are going to have to look at ways of working. We're going to have to look at prioritisation of complaints. I think there is, a 40% increase is not something that any organisation within current resource can resolve. And I would say, and I think this is a clear message, that I think resource going forward is going to have to be part of that picture. I think ways of working is absolutely, and innovation is something that will help us address this. But the resource picture is challenging, and I think that leads on from when my predecessor had updated the committee in that respect.
And as you identified there, you need to have the resource to manage that, and that may require you having more staff or more financial input to achieve that. Where do you see that coming into the budget process that you have to deal with?
So the challenge that I'm facing immediately is I took up post after the budget process had commenced. I've had informal discussions with the SPCB about how we may approach that as an organisation. The current budget bid that we have in place before the SPCB does not add at all to our investigative resource. Now, I think that there is a need for me to lay out more context and develop a case where if we don't have resource, then we will, over the next year and beyond, see the development of longer wait times. And I think I'm very conscious of the wider financial picture. I recognise that a 40% increase does not bring a 40% increase in resource. And I think for us as an organisation, and the message that I've placed very early on to our leadership team and our staff is that we need to look at our ways of working. We need to embrace innovation. We need to do so quickly. But there is a short-term pressure which will lead into the medium term very quickly in terms of times unless we are able to address that resource picture. So that's something that I do intend to write to the SPCB on in the coming period with the latest picture in terms of the demand on the organisation and also increasingly trying to forward look in terms of the forecast of where that may take key indicators of our service over the next year, 18 months and beyond.
Thank you very much. I'll now pass on to Evelyn Tweed for some questions.
Thanks, Convener. Mr McFadden, you've said about the record number of public service complaints. You've given us the drivers for why you think this is happening. How do you think you're going to help these organisations in the public sector deal with this, ballooning of complaints. What are you going to do to help them?
Yeah, it's a very good question, which takes us into the organisation's statutory remit over good complaints handling and model complaints handling procedures, the frameworks we have in place, the networks the way we have to engage with public services and their complaints handlers. We recently, very, very early on in my term, we had a conference of a national complaints conference with over 120 organisations, 200 staff involved directly there. And my message there was that we are starting a conversation on how we need to evolve those model CHPs, the framework and standards and the best practice guidance that we lay out. We have done a lot in this area. We have been a leader across the UK on this, but I think things have moved on in terms of some of what I've talked about in the nature of complaints, the nature of complainants, the developing technology picture, and I think there are areas there where our frameworks do need to be brought up to speed, and I think that's a conversation I've started there in terms of, well, what guidance, what work can we do to help address that increase in complaints and how we respond to that and how we tailor approaches and become better at targeting valuable resource. So that's in terms of the complaints handling aspects and how the organisations are dealing with that. That's always focused on them resolving as many complaints as possible, which is a very important part of that system. The second part of it is making more of the data and the insight that we have. And as I've said early on in my update, I think that's, for me, a strategic priority. I think the organisation has to do more there. I think we need to target more in terms of what those drivers of complaints. I think we need to make the connections with our data and our investigator experience in particular areas. So, particular areas of health and social care, for example, or local government, are the particular areas where we see common mistakes, common failures, in common areas where we're making recommendations and feeding that back in a more effective way. I think, as I've already touched on quite early on, a large part of my strategic focus is how we can become more systemic. I think you've seen across other ombudsman organisations in the UK the fact that grouping together themes, the more thematic intervention, more thematic reports, and a more systemic focus can really help target that and draw to attention to public services and indeed regulators and others scrutinising public services where changes may be made to help address some of that. So, some of that might be short term, but I think, as you can see, a lot of it is a long-standing pressure, and I think that the solution in itself is also, to an extent, medium to long term.
And you had mentioned in your previous answers about your investigative capacity and the fact that the budget was set, etc., and you want to dig into that and expand. And how important do you see that? Because obviously that's something that you're being criticised for.
Yeah, I think that I've seen the scrutiny I've heard from groups who've commented or quite publicly around the percentage of investigation. So I have been placing quite a bit of a focus on assessing that in the early stages, and there's more to do in that regard. It's part of what I referred to earlier about my kind of benchmarking of focus across other organisations, focused on the demand levels and what that's doing in terms of equivalent proportions. I think there's something really important here about that. And I think that when you look at SPSO, and when I've looked at the SPSO's process, well, 3 to 4%, I think at 1.6% would have been the final investigative stage. Of the remainder, and all of those complaints that we take in, there is a level of investigatory work. There's a level of work of inquiry. Often there is independent advice taken. We're taking views from both parties, and we're making assessments on that. And we're achieving outcomes. The other element is, as I mentioned, and this is something where the ombudsman model is increasingly evolved, is taking complainants through full investigation processes when at an early stage it may be quite apparent that the outcomes that we can achieve or what the organisation has already achieved is sufficient, and we're unlikely to be able to add to that, I think, is also an important part of that. So it is undoubtedly and has been a question of resource. And I think more resource does allow us to kind of place more in our investigative capacity. But I think it's also important to just reference that I think it is the right point. It sort of is the right approach to try and achieve the right outcome and decisions at as early a point as possible, as long as those decisions are rigorous and evidence based.
Thank you. If I can now move on to Megan Gallagher, and she's joining us remotely. Ms. Gallagher.
you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Mr McFadden, also congratulations on your new role. However, I think you do have your work cut out for you. I've just been on the website for the SPSO and it says that the current complaint allocation time is 16 weeks. Do you think as an organisation that is acceptable just to be allocated someone to review the complaint that's been submitted to the SPSO?
Yeah, thank you very much. As I mentioned at the start, a key element of confidence in the organisation for me is being fully transparent and having information on the organisation's performance, but also, and I think a key part of that is also your peer benchmarking and looking across other similar organisations, and that's something that I've been looking at very early in my term. I think when you look at 16 weeks, and that is a timescale that I do expect to increase with a 40% increase in complaints. It is comparable with other organisations, and I think when you look back, particularly the post-pandemic period, ombudsman organisations have been, struggling to deal with, first of all, backlogs created through that period, and at one point, the SPSO had an allocation time, as I understand it, of 10 months. Other organisations do have allocation periods there or longer. I think the current picture is that we are broadly comparable. Based on the information I have so far, I will put caveats on that because there is more to do there, but it's broadly comparable with other organisations. It is always a focus. It is clearly one of the most important ways in which people view our service, whether they're satisfied with our service, and it's important to get timely outcomes. So it is part of my focus. I think there are some opportunities in terms of ways of working at innovation, AI, as I say, but with that demand pressure, we have to be open and honest with people at the earliest points and throughout that there is that wait time. And we will continue to kind of do that at the earliest point and very publicly with people and in a very transparent way.
That's a really helpful answer. I think in relation to customer frustration or complainants frustration, they've maybe, for example, had to deal with a complaint that's lasted maybe 1 or 2 years with whatever body they've been dealing with. And then, of course, they come to the Ombudsman and then they've been hit with, again, a further 16-week wait just for someone to pick up their case before even beginning to investigate the complaint itself. So you can understand potentially the frustration and how desperate people are for the Ombudsman to step in and perhaps help within these circumstances. And I know obviously that's a driver in terms of what you're hoping to do as during your time within the SPSO. If I may move on to the annual report itself, because it shows that only 3.4% of total complainants considered went through to the full investigation stage. So going back to my original question of the 16-week wait time, then of course only 3.4% of those complaints going through to full investigation stage. How can the SPSO say that complainants are now receiving a better service? It just doesn't seem to add up to me.
So I think there's more for us to do as an organisation in explaining the intricacies of our process and the earlier stages of our process. When you look at that 3.4% figure, that's, I think my predecessor Rosemary referred to this as statutory investigation, and a lot of this comes from the ins and outs of our legislation. But our process, in terms of dealing with complaints, has various points to it. We have a triage and early decision point where we're focused on maybe more apparent or clear decisions that can be made, including that there is not much that as an organisation we'll be able to add to the response of the body. Or preliminary investigation, where we are undertaking investigatory work, we are undertaking inquiries. If you take a preliminary investigation and that final statutory investigation, the 3.4% together, last year you would look at about 39% of our activity was covered by of all all complaints closed were undertaken at those stages. Even from an early comparison and from my experience, that would compare with other public service ombudsmen. And I think there is more for us to do to explain not only what we do at those stages, but what comes out of those stages. So the preliminary investigation, which is before the 3.4% that you refer to, there will be significant outcomes that we achieve there. There will be decisions that we make there that are the right decision, that there is investigatory work or there's work on inquiries, there is independent advice that we take on those cases. So, so I think the picture is that there are, people are getting a full service there, but increasingly we are making decisions as early as possible, and for the reasons I've outlined earlier, I do think that is the right thing, particularly where resources are constrained. I think there's something in this, and also the question you raised on timeliness around prioritisation, and I think as an organisation, as an ombudsman, it is important and increasingly important that we are making sure we identify those complaints that are critical, and those complainants who are vulnerable, and those who need our help most. And there is a prioritisation, and the organisation has, throughout this process, a large focus on prioritising those who need a quicker answer and who need more in terms of our help. So that's certainly something that will continue to be a large part of my focus too.
No, thank you very much for that. And again, talking about, lessons to be learned, how to better the system. What follow-up support is given to people when the SPSO has not progressed their complaint to investigation stage? Because I'm sure you'll have, a lot of feedback from people who have contacted the SPSO, who, are struggling to work out what measures are in place to ensure that it's not the body or the organisation that's not acting unreasonably. In relation to complaint resolution, but also in terms of, signposting them to perhaps other areas where they might be able to seek some help.
A lot of our signposting will happen, at the very early stages of our process, and our advice and guidance team are very much focused on identifying, and going back to my previous answer, particularly those where there is a vulnerability or where there is a need for advocacy support, and we would refer and signpost either to other organisations that can help or to advocacy and support. I think there is a question around advocacy and support, and I'm very keen to engage with the third sector and advocacy agencies around about that, but I think there's a question around their own resourcing capacity. Even from early discussions, I think the very similar pressures that they face. And I think for people who are vulnerable, I think that's a system issue, a societal issue, where we need to be really careful about the support that they do get. So we do advise and signpost at the early stages. Clearly, as we go through our process, our follow-up to our own investigations or decisions or recommendations will be ensuring that the body takes is complying with the recommendations that we make, that things are put right. So that is a large part of our focus as well, to make sure that the body is taking the action that we identify is needed in relation to individuals, and indeed more systemically across their organisations.
That's helpful, thank you. And finally, if I may, Mr McFadden, it's on the extra duties of the SPSO. For example, NHS whistleblowing, the functionality surrounding that, also being the reviewer of the Scottish Welfare Fund role. Do you think the SPSO is at risk of being spread too thinly? And it's now perhaps shifting away from focusing on complaints to actually dealing with these other responsibilities as well? And how do you intend to balance that?
So I think the Whistleblowing Officer and Scottish Welfare Fund, those two statutory functions, I don't think they spread the organisation too thinly. I think they are very standalone. They are kind of self-sufficient parts of the organisation, which draw very little on the other parts of the organisation, place limited pressure there. I think there's actually a lot of cross-learning that we get from having those roles. I think if you take the Scottish Welfare Fund, and I know from my experience many years ago in helping to establish that, we're dealing with absolutely the most vulnerable people in our society, and I think there's a lot to learn from how we deal with those 300 to 400 people every year that we have taken over into public service complaints processes and wider aspects of the organisation. I think that includes how we try to adapt to being accessible and not having to have them make written complaints, being able to kind of find ways around about the statutory requirement for a written complaint and complaints handling, but also in many other ways. I think we understand the vulnerability there a lot more, and that is something we share across the organisation. I think the national whistleblowing role is obviously around 5 years since it's come in, 4 or 5 years since it's come into being with the SPSO. I think when services are under pressure, I think it's incredibly important that role is there, and I think we are an organisation that has the skills and is equipped and has the understanding of the sector to obviously be assessing those complaints and issues that come through there. by its nature, data is very systemic and focused, and I think the way that the complaints we look at those complaints, it is very much improvement focused and trying to kind of assess, how systemically we should feed back either to the organisations themselves or indeed other regulators such as his, and moving forward the Patient Safety Commissioner. So I think if that focus, that systemic focus and that focus on improvement, I think that is something that I'm very keen again to bring over to the wider organisation, given the priority that I've already said that we will place on that. I think there is more for us to do in kind of joining together our insight on both sides of that. There's a lot of confidentiality on the whistleblowing, and I actually think there is more we can do there in terms of cross-sharing rather than less. So I think, but to come back to the essence of your question, do these roles spread us too thinly? My answer would be no, because I see very self-sufficient parts of our organisation. The pressure on our organisation at this point, and as I can see moving forward, is in relation to those public service complaints and that 40% increase in demand.
Thank you very much, Mr McFadden. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. We now ask Fulton McGregor MSP, who's also joining us online, to ask a number of questions. Fulton.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr McFadden and the rest of the panel. Thanks very much for your evidence so far. I wanted to move on to some questions around about the complaints handling process in local authorities and other bodies. And I'll start with the new child-friendly complaints process across the public sector, which was launched this year. Paul, I'm wondering if you're able to, I know you're not long in post, but I wonder if you're able to give us an assessment of what difference you think this has made, and what difference would you like to see it being made over the coming years. I think, personally, I think it's a really good initiative, and we should all be working to child-friendly processes anyway, but I'm just wondering if you've had any chance to assess any early impact of that.
It is very early on, and I've not had the chance to do as much as I would like in assessing that. I think that, so I'll ask Andrew Crawford to give a sense, given that his team has led this. What I would say about this is to agree with you in terms of how progressive a development of this. I've seen across the UK and beyond how this has been looked upon by other ombudsmen in terms of a very forward-looking and progressive mood. I think progressive initiative. I think that this is very much a gold standard, and I think putting children's voices and rights at the heart of complaints handling is absolutely right, given even the low take-up of young people generally. But Andrew, is there anything you'd like to add there in terms of its rollout and effectiveness?
Yeah, thank you. I think we're seeing a real positive picture now. It's been in place for a little bit over a year now. We're starting to see the complaints come in, and we're starting to get real concrete evidence that organisations are following those duties and looking at the NCRC. I think the important thing is that when we did launch it, there was a lot of nervousness from organisations thinking it would be a lot more extra work, but actually the training that we've delivered, we've met with various organisations. We go out, we do workshops with senior managers, we work with complaints handlers that are at the front face. Actually, it's just those little extra bits that are put in, and it's now becoming part of, as you said, Fulton, as that process. So it's really embedded. We're seeing it starting to be embedded across. Certainly, local authorities are very good at it. Health are starting to get on board with it as well. The real challenges will be around, as Paul has said, is around resources within those authorities or within those public bodies to really dive deeper into it when they're needed. We haven't seen a high uptake from young people taking up the service. Most of the complaints that have came in have been brought to us on behalf of young people, but the checks are there now to ensure that their voice is part of that complaint, and I think that's the most positive thing that's came out of this in the past year.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I think that is an exciting development. I'm sure the committee, as well as other committees across the Parliament, will be interested to hear how that continues to develop. Other work that you're doing just now is sort of to improve access for those underrepresented in complaint statistics, and my notes here say such as female prisoners, which we can understand would be a very underrepresented group. I'm interested in how you're progressing work around this area, and also for people with other disabilities. How are you handling complaints from these areas? and I know it's probably not about going and trying to drum up work, certainly not with how busy you are or the nature of your work. That wouldn't be appropriate. But I'm always interested to see, how do you make sure that folks in these very underrepresented and disadvantaged groups know about the SPSO and how they can access it?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think that the profile of our complainants and how they relate to the overall population is very, very important. I think looking back, across my previous time at SPSO and with other ombudsman organisations, I think female prisoners is a group that has had a long-standing challenge there, and I know that's something that the Scottish Human Rights Commission have focused on recently. We have a project, we have an initiative to visit some female prisons, I believe and understand, in the new year, to try and speak directly with female prisoners to understand what may be going on there. But I think there's a lot more for us to do in terms of understanding and promoting an accessible culture. What I have been very pleased to see, like yourself, Fulton, is the focus on SIMD, and I think the laying over of our complainant demographic against areas of deprivation, that has always been an area for ombudsman organisations where they have struggled to take up, and I think the results of that look, from a cursory analysis, quite encouraging. But I think there's more to do. I think you do face questions about, in the face of your relentless demand, why are you going out to groups to identify more accessibility and potentially more complaints? And I think that speaks to that point I made earlier about the prioritisation of those who need us most. I think those coming through our door need to, those using services and those who are in most critical need often come from some of these groups. So I think there's more that we need to always do and never be complacent about that. Andrew, is there anything you'd like to add in relation particularly to the SIMD initiative?
Yeah, thank you. I think I've said the last couple of times that I've been here that that's a project that's been developing over a couple of years. It took us the best part of a year to analyse all that data, look at where the complaints were coming from. At the start of this year, we then were able to compile that data on our website. We have an interactive map that will show complaints against deciles 1 to 4, so we're focusing on those most vulnerable deciles. The next stage of that is to start engaging with local authorities or bodies across Scotland where we say there's a low uptake, or indeed there's an excessively high uptake, to find out if there's good practice there, what can we learn that then we can share with other local authorities or bodies. Part of that work is actually the first part of it starts tomorrow. We have a group through Citizens Advice in Edinburgh where we're piloting that, and it is around that basis of, do you know who SPSO is? Do you know where your rights are? Do you know how to complain? Were you happy if you've complained before? So those base questions that we're going to start to try and gather some data on, so that then we can go out and share good practice, or we can develop further training, or we can support guidance materials to make sure that that's accessible. The kind of next stages as we move through that, and obviously the deprivation index is due to be reviewed, will be that we'll gather that data again and we'll remap everything. And obviously with the increase of new builds as well, that changes the demographic picture slightly in a lot of these areas, but it will remain a focus on, certainly for my team within the organisation, of how we support users that are in vulnerable situations to access services when they're entitled to.
Thanks very much for that. It just sounds like really great proactive work around the SMID stuff, and also, talking about Paul talking about they're going out to the prisons in the new year to find out what's going on. So I really appreciate that, and again, something we'd be really interested in hearing updates on. Just as a final question, and Paul, you touched on this earlier about the social care and the adult care provision and things like that. Last year, we were told that relatives are often fearful of complaining about care provision because they think it might impact their relationship, or the care might not be provided anymore. This is something that actually, as MSPs and other elected members, we come across quite a lot, actually, because it doesn't even need to be the SPSO. People will come into our surgeries and say, I'm worried about my relationship with the council or the health board or whatever. Is this something that you've managed to get any more insight on, and is there anything that you think you can do more to improve matters and put people's minds at ease in this area? Because I know that this was raised last year with us as well.
I think that the answer to that is probably less on those who do come to us and more around those who don't, maybe touching on some of that kind of previous answer. I think the way for us to do that is to be engaging and outward, and I do think there's a priority for me that we are as an ombudsman focusing on outreach and going into areas where we may, there may be people who have these views, and I do think that that kind of fear of complaining or the consequence of complaining, going back to the previous answer again, is certainly something in female prisoners that may be a factor. So I think there's, more for us to do to unpick that. But I think at a service provider level, I think there's more we can do with our complaints handling best practice role, and as an ombudsman engaging on the culture of complaining and the accessibility of that, the openness of that. And I think that the very visible kind of outputs of that, so that people can see that complaining doesn't lead to consequences, that it is a healthy part of any organisation, in particular public services. For me, I think my immediate focus there will be in engaging with leaders across health and social care early in the new year, chief executives, and trying to kind of reinforce some of those messages that came through our complaint standards framework around about the healthy culture and making sure complaints teams are resourced, that complaints processes are visible, and that the outputs of what has changed as a result of complaints is also visible. So I think there's a kind of organisational, cultural aspect there. But going back to the first point of my answer, I think there's more for me perhaps to unpick in terms of some of those views among service users who don't come to our organisation. So that's certainly something I'll have down as a priority.
Thank you very much, Paul. Convener, that's me, but just before I pass back over to you, just want to wish Paul and his team all the best again, in case I don't come in with another question. And I know you're just at the start of your tenure, and it sounds that you've got a lot of good ideas, so thanks very much.
Thank you, Fulton. And if we can now move on to Mark Griffin and your questions. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. You touched earlier on about the use of AI in terms of generating submissions. And I just wonder if you have heard anything through your office about the use of AI from public bodies in terms of responding to complaints, what your view is of any potential use of AI in the public sector of responding to complaints, and whether your office uses AI at all.
Yes, it's a really, obviously an area that's growing apace, and I think there are two sides to it. There are those, I think, challenges in how complaints are being presented in very complex ways with, refer to precedent and rights and legislation, and trying to kind of maybe draw away from the kind of the centre root cause of an individual's complaint. I think on the other end, I think AI for organisations handling complaints, including ourselves, I think it is an opportunity, but it's one that we need to kind of take careful steps with. I think that you can see certainly in other ombudsman organisations, and we've seen at a recent complaints conference, some public bodies in Scotland using this in ways that will undoubtedly support efficiency and real help to investigators looking at complaints. The very basic kind of summarisation of large information, collation of that information, drafting to an extent, kind of some kind of elements of decisions, and really kind of getting to the heart of some of the insight. I think for me, and so I do think there is an opportunity there, and that is something that I think we as an organisation need to embrace, but also need to guide public service bodies on in terms of best practice, because there clearly are risks, and I think we've all seen examples of hallucinations and referral to things that are not quite as they are. So I think for me, there's always the need for human oversight and always the need for human input. And I think in particular, there is decision making is for an ombudsman organisation in particular, but I think throughout the complaints process for humans. And I think there's real opportunities in automation and robotic processing in terms of front end distillation of issues and complaints. But we always hear how valuable and essential the person-centred approach is, and how human contact, picking up the phone, and empathetic communication, even of a difficult decision, how influential that is, and how important that is in either understanding the issues that are being raised or how a public body has interacted. or in terms of what things need to change. So yeah, I think careful steps are needed. I think it's important that we are careful in terms of our governance as well, in terms of data and so forth. But I think there is a huge opportunity there to support investigation and decision making rather than replace it.
Okay, thanks. We, as a committee, considered and approved the SPSO's revised Statement of Principles for Complaints Handling Procedures in June this year, and I just wanted to ask what you think, what difference that will make and how you will monitor its impact.
Yeah, I think this is a really important part of the SPSO's work, and one that has been followed by all other ombudsmen and public service ombudsmen in the UK. I think the standards that we have set there are important and have led to very real improvements in complaints handling amongst public bodies. I think I've been pleased to see things like the Child Friendly Initiative, kind of take that forward and continue that on. And I think for me, in speaking to the principals, that kind of more person-centred and rights-based focus, making sure that is very clear in these is a very welcome approach. So I think that's a very important at that kind of strategic level and something that frames. I think what is really important, and getting me perhaps to your point around how we know what's happening, is the practicalities of implementation. I think there are things that we need to do to ensure these principles. We're helping organisations with that part of our role implement those principles, implement processes, procedures, accessibility mechanisms, and indeed decision-making mechanisms for their systems that reflect those principles. And I think there is a developing gap there. I think if you look at even just the question you've raised previously around AI, at the recent complaints conference, the question of us was, what should we be doing on this in terms of best practice? And so there's a gap there for us to make sure that however that's implemented, and come back to my point about human involvement, person-centred, contact, empathetic approaches, we need to make sure that any implementation of AI doesn't kind of ride roughshod over some of these core principles, which are so important to the effectiveness of complaints handling. I think in terms of monitoring, I think there is more that we can do. I think that does come back to a question of resources, however. I think there is more for us to do in looking at the data coming from complaints processes at that local level, in terms of how they're being handled and their own performance as public bodies, but also in terms of what the themes are. Part of a Miley focus looking at the drivers of demand, as I mentioned earlier, is trying to kind of understand what is happening there. And I think we can look at our 5,000–6,000 complaints and as the tip of the iceberg in terms of themes and issues and things that we find. But there's a lot more at a local level, and I think there's a challenge which we can't solve on our own there. I think we need to work with other agencies, other regulators, and the public service sectors themselves to understand better how we join our data up to it in that regard. And that comes to the point around monitoring. I think we need to have more information there, and we need to find a way of being able to assess that. That is a challenge in terms of resource, as I say, as a question of balancing different priorities. But it's one that I do see, I do place importance on.
And just on what you're saying there, organisations have got a responsibility under model complaint handling to publish statistics, but obviously they're only publishing statistics for the geographical area they cover, say if they're a council or a particular health board. What's your view on collation and publishing of those statistics at a national level? Do you have a view on whether that's right, whether it's appropriate, and a view on what your office has in terms of potential coordination of that work?
I think it is right, and I think it would add a huge deal. And I think I've still to, have to be honest, at this early in my term, assess the published information from health and local government in particular, where you're two of the sectors that we are publishing certainly the most information on the complaints. But going back to my point about the importance of looking at what's happening across complaints as a system, I do think there is a role for that. I think, is it a role for the SPSO now? We have a statute role to, I think it's monitor and promote best practice in complaints handling. Now, I would argue that does come in that territory, but I think there's a real question of resource. We have 2.8, under 3 full-time equivalent staff who are focused on this work. And a lot of that is around, ensuring that the CHPs are implemented, that the complaints handling is positive and improving, dealing with, engaging with networks, looking at training and getting to best practice. That question of, requiring the publication but also monitoring the data and making sure that the data is published in the right way, I think is a bigger task. We would like to do that. I think it does fit with our role as your statutory best practice complaints handling oversight. It is a question of resources, and I think it is going back to the earlier evidence around where do we place our focus when we have 40% more individuals seeking our help on complaints.
Okay, final question, Camilla. Now, this is our last evidence session with you and your team. We're running up to the dissolution of Parliament, and committee are thinking about legacy reports. Now, your predecessor felt that this committee possibly wasn't the appropriate committee to be scrutinising you and your role, given that your remit goes far beyond local government housing and planning that we cover. So, just in that context, what is your view on the appropriate mechanism or committee for scrutiny of you and your team in Parliament?
Yeah, I'd seen the scrutiny on the landscape review, and I think that kind of discussion around about where we should direct our assurance, and I think this idea of a more kind of holistic and dedicated committee would be something that I think would be right. It's not to denigrate any of the scrutiny coming from this committee or others. I think looking back, when the local government committee was identified as the appropriate committee for scrutiny, local government complaints were the largest percentage of complaints we received. That shifted. Health is now a larger percentage of it, so even that would indicate that a change is needed. And then there's a question of the resources, and I know some of the previous evidence from my predecessor and with the committee was around, should this be the Finance Committee or others? And I think for me, that there would be benefit to Parliament and indeed to the SPSO in being able to have conversations in the round around things like our impact, our performance, the percentage of investigations, the pressures and the work we're doing externally with that resource picture. They're very separate at the moment, and I don't think you can separate those two. Increasingly, we're going to have to think about those two things in the round. So for me, scrutiny that is able to kind of look at those things in the round would be beneficial for Parliament and for SPSO. I do think there's a conversation I'd like to have a bit more about the regularity of that. I think that currently SPSO coming to the committee once a year does feel a little bit light when I compare with other scrutiny mechanisms of ombudsman organisations I've been with. I think if you look at an example of very short-term critical spikes in complaints coming to an organisation, that feels like something that we should be speaking to Parliament about earlier. And I think waiting for an annual scrutiny appearance may not fit with that. So I think that does present risks in that scrutiny for Parliament and for SPSO and for those indeed that we serve. So I think there's a discussion there, and I think there's something more broader than that for me, and that's our relationship with Parliament in terms of our insight. What relationship should we have to subject specific committees around some of that insight? I mean, the Health Committee, for example, and the huge amount that we see coming through our investigations and our work and the learning that we have there. I think there are more opportunities there. What should we be providing in terms of the reports, not just from investigations, but from our preliminary investigations, as I mentioned earlier, some of the outcomes. So there's a bigger question there, I think. But yeah, to get to the heart of the answer, I think that a dedicated committee would be something that would work for Parliament and for SPSO.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you very much for your questions this morning. There's one area maybe I'd just like to touch on before you finish. You've given us a good overview about where you are and as an organisation, what you're trying to achieve and where you're going. But complaints about SPO services themselves are potentially problematic. It would be a good view to get a view or a flavour from yourself as to where you see that going, because they are also at a record high about how you manage that as an organisation. And going forward, that is an area that you will require to tackle.
Yes, I think that this is, speaking back to the point that I raised around the confidence in the organisation and a holistic picture there, your feedback, complaints, reviews, quality and benchmarking. I think that's something that's very important to me, because I think it's important for people having confidence in the organisation. If I look at the service complaints specifically, So the statistics that I think are in the annual report and have to hand is that last year we had around 140, maybe just below that in terms of service complaints. The year before 122. Now, first of all, when you look at the demand for our service and the contacts that we have, so the 5,200 complaints we had last year plus additional contacts through advice, guidance and signposting, it is a very small proportion. I think that is an important point of context. From my experience, it is comparable to other organisations. And I think when you look at the external scrutiny that we have through the independent service complaints reviewer, I think last year somewhere in the range of 16 complaints were there, and I'm not sure that any of them were fully upheld. I think there were points where they were partly upheld. So that's not to dismiss the significance or importance or the need to continue to monitor that. And I think, but there is just a little bit of context there, I think, as we see rising complaints numbers, interactions with people who perhaps are unhappy with aspects of this will also increase. I think what is really important to me in looking at the complaints reviewers report and some of the complaints that we have had is what are we seeing through those. And I think it is it's fair to say that the vast majority of issues we see are related to timeliness and communication. Again, which you would probably expect. I think digging underneath that again, there's this question of the frequency and regularity of update from people. I think it is an area to monitor. If I'm being objective looking in, is it a red flag, that increase from 120 to 139? I wouldn't say it necessarily is, but I'm not complacent about that, and that's something I'll continue to look at and monitor.
Well, can I thank you for your evidence this morning and your questionings from the committee, and wish you well for the future. As you know, we're coming to the end of our session here in the next few months, and that will be the case. But we'll now suspend for a moment while you leave the room. Thank you so much. Thank you and welcome back. We now move on to item 3 for formal consideration of one negative instrument. The negative instrument under consideration is the Building Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025 SSI 2025312. The committee previously considered this SSI on the 18th of November, but agreed to seek further information from the Scottish Government following a submission that we received from the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland. We have now received that response. Do members have any comments with reference to the instrument? Okay, there's nothing. So is the committee agreed that we do not wish to have any recommendations in relation to this instrument? Thank you. As previously agreed, we'll take the next item of the agenda in private, and that concludes the public session of today's meeting. Thank you.